Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
Good morning. Today is Wednesday, May 20th, 2026. The Republican primary in Kentucky's 4th Congressional District is decided. Representative Thomas Massie, a 7-term member of the House of Representatives, by every measurable standard among the most consistent constitutional conservatives in Congress, has lost his primary to Ed Galain, a retired Navy SEAL captain endorsed by the President of the United States. Ed Galain received 57,822 votes, or 54.9%. Thomas Massie received 47,539 votes, 45.1%. Total turnout in last night's Republican primary was 105,361 votes. The age crosstabs in the exit polls are the first signal of what is truly interesting about this result. Voters under 26 went for Massie by 25 points. Voters 26 to 35 by 56 points for Massie. The 36 to 45 demographic by 38 points for Massie. And 46 to 55 also went for Massie by 18 points. But on the demos above 56 years old, they all broke for Galain. 56 to 65 by 18 points, 66 to 75 by 35 points, and 76 and over by 33 points. The under 56 Republican electorate stayed with the constitutional conservative by wide margins. The over 55 Republican electorate moved with the president, and the unremarkable Galain campaign also by extremely wide margins. The result is the consequence of that movement combined with a turnout surge concentrated in that same demographic. This is a quite remarkable age striation here, and even more telling mobilization story. But before I get into those numbers further, I want to tell you what this episode was supposed to be and what it is now instead. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions podcast. This is episode piece 2 of a multi-part feature on the 2026 Libertarian National Convention, which opens Thursday, May 21st at the Amway Grand Plaza and the DeVos Place Complex in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The theme is Freedom Calls. The companion article for this piece, published Tuesday morning on Substack, is titled Libertarians Being Libertarian: Caucuses, Adjacent Movements, and the Standard at Grand Rapids. It carries the forensic treatment of the chair race, structural reforms on the convention floor in full, the Mises Caucus, the Classical Liberal Caucus, the Radical Caucus, and the Ron Paul movement adjacent to the party. The institutional analysis is there. If that is what you came for, the article is where to find it. This episode was supposed to be the spoken voice version of that article with some additional context. The convention chair race, the bylaws revision, the floor strategy at Grand Rapids. The original script was drafted along those lines. The result last night in Kentucky's 4th Congressional District, however, demands a different episode. A 7-term Republican incumbent, not facing legal trouble, not facing personal scandal, not facing redistricting, not facing any of the conditions under which incumbents typically lose primaries, has been defeated. The defeat occurred in a non-presidential primary year, the cycle in which incumbents are most insulated from challenge. The arithmetic of the defeat is unusual enough to warrant a careful look. The questions the arithmetic raises are sharp enough to warrant asking out loud. This is what this episode is now. A contemporary analysis of a specific election that, by any honest historical standard, should not have produced the results it did. Before we get to the timeline and the numbers, I want to spend a few minutes on what we know about House primaries in general, because framing matters. The incumbency advantage in the United States House of Representatives is one of the most studied phenomena in American political science. The summary version: incumbents win. They win at rates that approach the boundaries of what an electoral system can produce while remaining nominally competitive. The Open Secrets Project, which has tracked re-election rates across every congressional cycle of the post-Watergate era, summarizes the matter plainly. House incumbents have wide name recognition, structural framing advantages, established district networks, and the institutional weight of the office itself. Re-election rates routinely exceed 95% in general elections, and in primaries, the rate is higher still. In the 2024 cycle, by Ballotpedia's tally, 381 House incumbents filed for re-election. 4 of them lost in primaries. That is approximately 1%. In 2022, the figure was higher. 13 lost primaries, but every one of those losses was tied to a specific cause. Most were votes to impeach Donald Trump after January 6th. Some were redistricting changes that put 2 incumbents in the same district, and a handful were ethics scandals or other legal issues. The pattern, what I'm saying, is consistent across cycles. House incumbents lose primaries when something is wrong: legal exposure, ethics violations, personal scandal, redistricting that radically changes the district. Basically, the question is, what did this member do to lose the confidence of their voters? When that answer is concrete, specific, and on the record, that's when they lose. The historical baseline for an incumbent losing a primary in a non-presidential year with no legal issues, with no personal scandal, no redistricting, no impeachment vote, no high-profile betrayal of the base on dogmatic issues, that baseline, that approaches 0. Now consider Massie's profile. 7 terms in the House. Prior primary margin victories, 75% in 2022 against 3 challengers, 81% in 2020, 75% in 2018. No indictments, no ethics investigations, no reported personal scandals, no redistricting. The objections raised against him in the campaign that just concluded were policy disagreements with the President of the United States on issues Massie has been consistent on his entire tenure of Congress. These were not the kind of objections that historically produce incumbent defeats. I want to take one more piece of context here before the timeline. Non-presidential primary turnout in the state of Kentucky. The 2022 Republican primary statewide drew approximately 386,000 votes cast in the United States Senate race, the marquee statewide contest that year, the renomination of Rand Paul. That figure represents roughly 23 to 24% of the registered Republican population of the time. That number, 23 to 24%, is the modern baseline for Republican primary turnout in Kentucky during a non-presidential cycle. It is held with reasonable consistency across multiple cycles, 23 to 24%. The voters who turn out in a non-presidential primary at that baseline rate are the most engaged, most ideologically committed, most reliable members of the party base. They are the voters who know who their congressman is. They are the voters who follow legislative votes. They are the voters who, in a district like Kentucky's 4th, represented for 14 years by Thomas Massie, have a stable, well-developed picture of what they're voting for and why. That is the baseline. A 7-term incumbent with no scandal, a non-presidential primary, an engaged-based voting in customary numbers. Under those conditions, the historical probability of an incumbent losing is effectively zero. Last night produced an incumbent loss and a loss over 9 percentage points. The arithmetic that produced it is on the record. But before the numbers, the chronological backstory, because the result, however unusual, did not arise from nothing. It arose from a sequence of events that began roughly 2 years ago. Let's begin in May of 2024. Thomas Massie had represented Kentucky's 4th Congressional District for 12 years at that point. He had voted against federal spending bills authored by both parties. He had co-sponsored war powers resolutions when the executive branch exceeded its Article I bounds. He had built a homestead on his own land in Kentucky and lived the kind of self-reliant, rural, conservative life the Republican Party once held up as an aspiration. He had not, to that point, taken a public position on Israel or the Israel lobby. In May of 2024, he sat for a 2-hour interview with Tucker Carlson. Most of the interview was about his life, his farm, his family, his approach to legislating. In the middle of the conversation, the question came up of how Congress works. Massie described, in the same matter-of-fact tone he used to discuss his homestead, the process by which the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, corrals legislative support. He described being asked, as a candidate, to write a position paper for them. He declined. He told them he did not, in his words, do homework for lobbyists. He knew it was a test whether or not the congressman would acquiesce to any of their requests. He laughed about it. He was not angry at AIPAC. He simply was not going to play along. That interview, by Massie's own account, was the pivot point of his political life. He committed what he called the crime of transparency. He pulled back the curtain on a process most members of Congress carry out quietly. From that point forward, his position inside the Republican conference shifted. Not on policy, his voting record was already what it was, but on tolerance from leadership. He won his June 2024 primary anyway, with 75% of the vote. In 2025, the second Trump administration took office in January, and by April, the House Judiciary Committee was invited to a dinner at the Department of Justice with Attorney General Pam Bondi. The dinner was, on the public record, the moment it became clear the administration's prior stated commitment of releasing the Epstein file was not going to be honored. Bondi told the committee that nothing remained in the files but child pornography, the clear implication being that further inquiry was not appropriate. Massie did not believe it. He had heard from the victims personally. He knew of information still not released to the public. In July of 2025, Massie introduced the Epstein Files Transparency Act and the discharge position needed to force a vote. He had, by his initial count, approximately a dozen Republican co-sponsors. Most of them removed their names under direct pressure. The Republican Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, called Massie's bill dog crap. Well, that's Massie's cleaned up words for it. Publicly, Johnson said, it was poorly drafted and harmful to the survivors. But the survivors came out publicly and did not agree. 3 Republican women signed the discharge petition under the pressure from the Republican caucus and from the president. They did not remove their names. Those representatives were Nancy Mace, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Lauren Boebert. Greene took death threats against her children, and by her own account, when she brought those threats to the president, the president told her the threats were her fault and told her that if she continued to insist on releasing the files, she would hurt his friends. Boebert was taken into the White House Situation Room, the room used to conduct kill or capture operations against foreign terrorists. It was there she was pressured directly. When it became clear the pressure tactics did not work and that the bill would pass with these Republicans joining the Democrats, the dynamic shifted. And not wanting to go on record against it, the remainder of the GOP caucus changed their vote. The bill passed the House on November 12, 2025 by a vote of 427 to 1. The Senate passed the bill unanimously before it formally arrived for the president to sign into law a week later. On December 19, 2025, the Department of Justice released a partial set of files. A release the bill's principal co-sponsor declared on the public record a violation of the law itself, because the unreleased material the law required to be released, remains undisclosed to this day. Also, back in June of 2025, Israel and the United States struck Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan without congressional authorization. The strikes occurred while Iranian uranium enrichment remained within the bounds the Non-Proliferation Treaty permits. The strikes occurred while successive American intelligence community assessments have stated there was no evidence of an active Iranian weapons program. Massie co-sponsored a War Powers resolution with Representative Ro Khanna of California. His public statement on the strikes was 4 words: "This is not constitutional." This was entirely consistent with Massie's position on foreign entanglements, regardless of political party. And another topic, the big, beautiful bill, the second term administration's flagship spending package. It was passed in July of 2025, raising federal expenditures above the previous administration's baselines. Massie, as he has done on every single omnibus spending bill that raised the deficit and debt, voted against it. As a side note, the BBB originally defunded transgender surgery procedures for minors. The Senate stripped that provision out, and the final version restored to include funding for those procedures. With this in mind, the pressure on the Epstein files, the War Powers Act, and the voting against the BBB, President Trump in October of 2025 endorsed Ed Galain. Trump-aligned political action committees activated. The president then exaggerated claims or made up entire mistruths about Massie's record. He appeared in person at a rally in Hebron, Kentucky in March of 2026 to characterize Massie's record before Kentucky voters directly. He stated Massie voted against stopping the defunding of transgender surgical procedures, the language from the first version of the BBB, when in reality it was the second version with funding restored that Massie actually voted against on fiscal grounds. The advertising campaign against him ran the first version's procedural posture as if it had been the final bill, attacking him for opposing what the final bill actually contained. The parallels to Orwell are uncanny. And then 2 weeks ago, May 6, 2026, Massie returned to Tucker Carlson for another long-form interview. He documented on the public record the funding configuration of the campaign against him. The principal funders behind a super PAC called MAGA Kentucky: Miriam Adelson, the widow of the late Sheldon Adelson, the casino magnate, Paul Singer, and John Paulson. The mechanism by which AIPAC was routing money to Galain's campaign through a payment vendor called Democracy Engine, funded by a co-founder of Act Blue. Yes, the same supporter of the Democrat Party. Approximately $32 million in combined spending across campaigns and outside groups made this the most expensive United States House primary in American history. And that brings us to today. The primary is now decided. The result is the endpoint of the sequence I have just walked through. It's not the beginning of anything. It's the consequence of decisions made over 2 years. Let us move to the math, because the math of last night is part of the story that most cable coverage will skip past. Let's compare three primaries, 2022, 2024, and 2026. Begin with 2022. May 17th, 2022, Massie's last contested Republican primary in a non-presidential or off-year cycle. He faced three challengers: Claire Worth, Alyssa Darrell McDowell, and George Washington. The official Kentucky Secretary of State results are these. Massie received 50,301 votes. Worth received 10,521, and McDowell received 3,446. Washington, somewhere over 2,600. The total turnout was 66,874 votes. Massie's percentage in 2022 was 75.2%. The combined opposition, the three candidates, 16,573 votes, was 24.8%. As a share of registered Republicans in the district at the time, roughly 285,000 of them, the turnout was approximately 23 to 24%. That figure aligns precisely with the modern Kentucky non-presidential primary baseline. Now, 2024, May 21st, 2024, a presidential primary year with Donald Trump's renomination on the same ballot. Massie received 39,000 votes, and the two challengers, Michael McGinnis and Eric Dieters, 12,604 votes combined. Total turnout, 52,593. Massie's percentage in 2024 was 75.9%, almost identical to 22. The total turnout was actually lower than 2022 in raw votes, 52,000 against 66. But when looking at it, it is consistent because the presidential primary had been substantially decided before the May vote. So, to last night, May 19th, 2026, a non-presidential year, thus a proper comparison to 22. Galain received 57,822 votes. Massie received 47,539 for a total turnout of 105,361 votes. In case you forgot the numbers I said earlier, let's do a side-by-side comparison, because the comparison is the story. In 22, the total Republican primary turnout was 66,874. Last night, the total was 105,361. That's an increase of 38,487 voters, 58% more than the last comparable midterm primary. Massie's vote count between 22 and 26 declined by 2,700 votes, 2,762 precisely, from 50,301 to 47,539. Thus, a small contraction. His base in raw votes held to within about 5% of where it stood 4 years ago. Note, it also went up from where it was 2 years ago in raw totes. But the combined Republican primary opposition in 22 was 16,573 votes, split amongst three challengers. Galain tonight alone received 57,822, 3.5 times the combined opposition vote of the 22 primary, 250% increase. As a percentage of registered Republicans, the Kentucky Secretary of State's May 2026 file documents 311,007 registered Republicans in Kentucky's 4th Congressional District. The 105,361 votes cast tonight represent approximately 34% turnout. The 2022 figure and the rest of the contemporary elections were between 23 and 24%. That's a huge uptick. Tonight's turnout is roughly 44% above the 22 midterm comparison and roughly 70% above the baseline for the Commonwealth. There's one more piece of arithmetic. Where did the 38,000 votes come from? The exit polling and the age crosstabs answer that question with unusual clarity. The new voters were not distributed across the age spectrum. They were concentrated almost entirely in the over 55 demographic. Voters under 56 broke for Massie by margins ranging from 17 to 56 points. But voters over 55 broke for Galain by margins ranging from 18 to 35 points. The under 56 cohort, Massie's coalition, turned out in higher numbers than 2022 and stayed with him. The over 55 cohort, Galain's coalition, turned out at a level the district has not seen in a non-presidential election in modern memory. That's the math. Massie's coalition held, as you would expect from an incumbent. An incumbent with no scandals, no violations, no concerns. His coalition held. The opposition coalition was conjured almost entirely from the over 55 demographic, with almost entirely new voters in the non-presidential primary voting in that district. And they broke for Galain at margins of 18, 35, and 33 points across those three demographics. Now, I want to ask the question that the math forces us to ask. I want to lay this out cleanly because the question is sharper than the cable coverage will treat it. What did Thomas Massie do in his 14 years representing Kentucky's 4th congressional district to earn the animosity of the over 55 Republican demographic that turned out last night at twice the historical rate to vote against him? Let me list what Massie did not do. Thomas Massie did not draft legislation to terminate Social Security. He did not draft legislation to reduce Social Security benefits. He did not draft legislation to raise the Social Security retirement age. The bills he authored on entitlement spending were directed at federal deficit reduction across the budget, not at specific benefits of the over 55 cohort relies upon. Thomas Massie did not draft legislation to terminate Medicare. He did not draft legislation to reduce Medicare benefits. He did not draft legislation to means test Medicare. He did not draft legislation to alter the Medicare eligibility threshold. The Medicare program, as the over 55 demographic assesses it, has not been threatened by any bill Thomas Massie has authored, co-sponsored, or championed. Thomas Massie did not draft legislation to terminate veterans benefits or veterans health care or TRICARE or any of the programs administered by the Department of Veterans Affairs that disproportionately serve the older cohort within his district. Thomas Massie did not take any vote on the floor of the House of Representatives that materially threatened the financial security of the demographic that voted against him tonight at 3-1 and 4-1 margins. That's what he did not do. Now consider what he did do. He voted against the war with Iran without congressional authorization. He co-sponsored a war powers resolution to assert Article 1 authority over the executive branch's military decisions. He took the position that the Constitution requires Congress to authorize the use of force. Thomas Massie also introduced legislation to require the release of the Epstein files. And he carried that legislation through to enactment by a House vote of 427-1. He did the work that the law requires the executive branch to have already done. He did it over the explicit opposition of the President of the United States, the Speaker of the House, the Attorney General, and the Department of Justice. Thomas Massie voted against the spending package that raised federal expenditures above the levels set by the Biden administration. He cited fiscal responsibility. The vote was consistent with his 14 years of fiscal voting on his part. That's the record. Congressional war powers, sex trafficking accountability, fiscal restraint. These are the votes that the demographic, which turned out at twice the historical rate, decided required his removal from office. So, what is happening here? Was the alternative so compelling? Did Ed Galain run a campaign of such force, of such substance, of such public engagement, that the demographic looked at him and concluded he must be elevated above the 7-term incumbent.
I hope the fake news gets this. Tom Massie stands with the ladies of The View. Tom Massie stands with the ladies of The View. Mr. President, we stand with you. Fight, fight, fight! USA! USA!
I'm telling you, that is the greatest candidate.
The record of the campaign is on the public record. Ed Galain refused to debate Thomas Massie. The Massie campaign extended multiple invitations over the course of the cycle. Each invitation was declined. The single most prominent libertarian-leaning Republican in Congress was prepared to share a stage with a candidate the president had endorsed, and the president's endorsed candidate would not appear. Ed Galain conducted the bulk of his campaign from his home. The reporting on the campaign throughout the spring documented a candidate who was difficult to find at public events, difficult to find at retail political stops, difficult to find at the venues where candidates traditionally make themselves available to voters. The comparison most frequently drawn to was Joe Biden's 2020 basement campaign. And that comparison is not seen as flattering. The public events Ed Galain did appear at were sparsely attended. The reporting and the photography from those events, again on the public record, documented small crowds at venues built for larger ones. The victory party last night, which I've seen photographs from, was sparsely attended. For an event unseating a 7-term incumbent in the most expensive primary in American history, you would have expected a big celebration. Ed Galain has spoken in public on the campaign trail about his preferences for restoring the conscription draft. He has on the record lamented the termination of the draft in 1973. He has framed mandatory military service as something a generation of Americans would benefit from being subjected to. This is a candidate in 2026 advocating for the reinstitution of a policy whose termination is regarded across the political spectrum, including by the demographic that voted for him tonight, as one of the most durable achievements of the late 20th century. This is the candidate the over 55 Republican electorate of Kentucky's 4th congressional district decided required their support against a 7-term incumbent. The record of the campaign does not explain the result. The candidate's substantive case does not draw the voters. The candidate himself was not visible enough to have drawn them on personal appeal. So I want to walk through the conventional explanations one by one and ask whether each of them holds. Explanation 1, Trump loyalty. The over 55 Republican electorate is so loyal to the president that they will turn out at twice the historical rate to remove an incumbent the president opposes, regardless of the candidate's historical merits. Is the over 55 Republican electorate that responsive to $32 million in paid messaging? Is the loyalty that mechanical? The voters who turned out last night against Massie were, in many cases, voters who had supported Massie in prior cycles. This is by definition, since the turnout was concentrated in the cohort that historically votes most reliably. The same voters who returned Massie to office with 75 and 81% of the vote in prior primaries decided this year, after $32 million in paid messaging, that the president's preferences superseded their own multi-cycle assessment for their representatives' work. Is that what blind party loyalty looks like? Explanation 2, the Iran war. The over 55 Republican electorate is so strongly approved of the strikes on Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, the preemptive war of choice against Iran, that they decided Massie's constitutional objection to those strikes and to this war warranted his removal? Is the war with Iran that popular among the over 55 Republican electorate of Kentucky's 4th congressional district? The proposition that the over 55 demographic was so unwavering in support of unauthorized military action against a non-imminent threat that they would remove a 7-term incumbent over the matter. Again, looking at other polls, that proposition does not match the available evidence. Explanation 3, the Epstein files. The over 55 Republican electorate so strongly approved of the administration's decision to release only a partial set of the Epstein files in violation of the law, passed unanimously by the Senate and 427-1 by the House, that they decided that Massie's persistent insistence on full compliance, that required his removal. Is the protection of a network of figures named in the unreleased Epstein material that important to the over 55 Republican electorate of Kentucky's 4th? I mean, I wouldn't think so. The over 55 demographic is not, in my experience, an apologist for sex trafficking. The over 55 demographic is not, in my experience, an apologist for the use of executive power to obstruct the application of law passed by their representatives in Congress. So explanation 4, the federal budget. The over 55 Republican electorate is so strongly approved of the administration's decision to raise federal expenditures above the Biden administration's baseline that they decided Massie's vote against that spending package warranted his removal. Is fiscal expansion under a Republican president popular with a demographic that historically held the strongest commitment to fiscal restraint as a Republican principle? The Tea Party movement that revolutionized the Republican primaries between 10 and 14 was disproportionately composed of voters in that very cohort that turned out against Massie tonight. The proposition that the same demographic that drove the Tea Party would, 15 years later, vote against the most reliably fiscally restrained Republican in Congress over his refusal to support expanded spending. That proposition requires a level of explanation that I just don't have. None of the conventional explanations holds on its own. I do not believe that the voters who turned out last night at twice the historical rate were principally motivated by the president's enthusiasm for unauthorized war, by the president's protection of named figures in the Epstein record, by the president's spending package, or by any combination of policy concerns that I've been able to identify. The voters were motivated by all available evidence by $32 million in paid messaging directed at the demographic most responsive to a particular kind of paid messaging on behalf of a candidate who could not have drawn them out on his own merits, against an incumbent whose records on the issues those voters historically cared most about was the record that he supported. Now, I'm not going to assert any conspiratorial explanation because I don't have evidence for one. I will not say the result was illegitimate because the votes were cast and the votes were counted. I will say that the math of last night, the numbers, are the numbers of saturation paid messaging directed at a demographic whose susceptibility to that messaging is now the principal electoral question of the next 2 years for any libertarian leading candidate who hopes to challenge the configuration that produced this result. That becomes the question for us. The questions are sharper than the answers, and I'm content to leave them in that condition for now, because the alternative is to assert what I do not have the evidence to assert. In 2 days, on Thursday, May 21st, roughly 1,000 delegates of the Libertarian Party gather at the Amway Grand Plaza in DeVos Place Complex on the Grand River in Grand Rapids, Michigan. 5 days of platform debate, bylaws revision, officer elections, and ratification of strategic direction for the next 2 years. The question I asked tonight will be in the air in Grand Rapids. The delegates arrive having watched the most prominent libertarian-leaning Republican in Congress lose a primary that, by every historical measure, should not have been losable. They arrive into a moment in which the configuration that defeated him is on display, on the public record, and not yet adequately answered by the political institutions that nominally exist to answer such things. I will be in Grand Rapids beginning on Thursday morning. I will be carrying the Consequential Actions table in the vendors hall during non-voting periods. If you're at the convention, find me there. Bring the questions, bring the disagreements, bring the convention experience to a table where the question is, what did we just watch? And what are we going to do about it? The Constitutional Conservative Coalition that returned Thomas Massie to office in 3 consecutive primaries with 75, 81, and 75% of the vote did not disappear tonight. They turned out in higher raw numbers than they did in 2024 and 2022. They're still there. In the under 56 cohort of every district in the country that contains a Republican primary, they're looking for an institutional home that will defend the principles that they thought they were voting for when they pulled the Republican lever for Thomas Massie last night, and which the Republican Party, as institutionally configured, has now demonstrated in the most expensive House primary in American history, it is not interested in defending. The Libertarian Party at Grand Rapids has the opportunity to be that home for those disaffected Republicans. Whether it takes that opportunity depends on what the delegates do this week. I am Jeff Galain, and this has been Piece 2 of a multi-part feature on the Libertarian National Convention of 2026, Libertarians Being Libertarian, on the Consequential Actions podcast. For the corresponding article and for the full forensic treatment of the chair race, the caucuses, the adjacent movements, and the standard at Grand Rapids, visit consequentialactions.com. For the video version of this episode and the convention to come, find me on YouTube at Consequential Actions Podcast. For real-time updates from the floor in Grand Rapids beginning on Thursday, look for me on X at JKillick. Until next time, have a great day.